Capricorn 18, the Union Jack. Well, this is the flag of the United Kingdom, and there was a time during the channeling of these Sabian symbols when the British Empire was the dominant force in the world, and so the Union Jack represented the power of state gone to the extreme. Today that's replaced by America. In the past it was Rome. It will be something else at some point in the future. It changes, but nevertheless the idea of the power of state does not. So that's what we're studying, the existence of the state. Now, we need a force of government in order to tell us what to do, for one reason alone, and that is because we're not very responsible ourselves. Left to our own devices, we tend to do something which is selfish, insensitive, unsustainable in the ecological terms. We're not very grown up as a species. And even those people who are pretty enlightened in this respect, and they are very self-responsible, even the best of us, we need an umbrella of control, and the state therefore exists. There may come a time, perhaps thousands of years from now, when the individual is sufficiently self-responsible to do away with the need for a government, and that would be anarchism in the truest, most pure sense of the word. But that's not going to happen in our lifetime. In fact, the very reverse has happened in our lifetime, that the power of the state is very dark indeed. We're given the illusion that there is democracy and that we get a say in what happens, but that's a lie. The real people that pull the strings, they pull the strings on presidents and on world leaders because of their money, and they're the rulers of the world. So the warning in this message is that the state is necessarily going to become corrupt. Necessarily. And therefore, all of us have to come to terms with the fact that we're living under a tyranny. That there is no justice, not finally, not for the guys that pull the strings. And really, not for anyone else either, because the application of justice is corrupted, and therefore nobody really gets a fair deal. It's terrible, it's sad, it's a horrible thing to understand, to come to terms with. And yet each of us must come to terms with that. And the way we actually make this into a good thing is very subtle indeed. This is perhaps one of the most difficult mysteries of all of them to work with. How do we actually embrace the fact that there is above us a tyrant, a tyrannical system into which we must fit somehow, because we simply will never have enough power to take on that state, individually or even collectively as a group of good people. That state is always in place. How do we come to terms with that? And I think the first thing to realize is that we brought it upon ourselves, and we do that not only historically, but moment by moment. We bring it upon ourselves moment by moment. That the state exists, we cannot really determine differently. It does, and it will. But what that does to us, how that impinges upon our lives, how that limits our freedom of expression, that we can change. There is a deeper truth than the existence of tyranny in the world, and that deeper truth, we must unlock the secret of that, and then we're free of the tyranny. Each of us experiences that tyranny in different ways. For some people, younger people particularly, it comes through parents, and then bosses, and then peer group pressure, and so on. These are all agencies through which the state's power apply. Not only the police force and the courts of justice, but If we look in the current era at the lockdown and the masks and COVID and all of that, if you go into a shop without wearing a mask in some places in the world, it is the people, not only the shop owners and so on, it's the other people in the shop that will give you a hard time for not wearing the mask. And so this is how it all filters down. A certain number of people support the state and become agencies of the state. And we have a dark version of this in the former Soviet system, when it is estimated that about 50% of people were informants, the KGB informants in Russia and the Soviet system. It is not a dark eminence over there in Washington that we're talking about. It's the existence of that force in our lives. And if you find that you really can't stomach it, you really want to get away from it, then you can do that. You can. And yet you need to be determined to and clear about how you do that. The things that are most of concern to the state cost money. It runs through the system of taxation. And certain things are forbidden to us, certain permissions are not given to us, and that's a state power as well, like traveling to certain countries and so on, and that could be a real imposition. And yet, primarily, it's to do with money. So if you can move yourself away from their money system, you move further and further away from their reach. This is how it's done. We need to become as self-sufficient as we possibly can be, relying upon a small amount of money as we can, so we can barter food and swap favors and help each other out and form little communities of people that do each other favors without counting the cost. That's one way forward. But there's an even more subtle way. That's the way that people will be talking about in the next decades, I'm sure, how to create self-sustaining communities that don't depend upon money. And it's been going around for quite some time, but it's not really settled, and it will have to settle more clearly into the future. But the more subtle power that I'm referring to is a very, very subtle secret indeed. It is to do with your understanding of quantum mechanics. And there exists any number, an uncountable number of alternate realities that are there for the living, for the taking. And they surround us. Every single version of our lives is replicated in an alternative reality. And this is not airy-fairy fantasy nonsense. This is modern physics. This is quantum mechanics. It's not been interpreted and explained very well for the last 100 years we've known about this. But if you actually understand it, you can get that the world that we think of as reality is simply one of an uncounted number. And we can slip from ours into another if we have the ability to change how we use the mind. If we use the mind with great elegance and grace and subtlety, then we can have a beautiful life free of tyranny. And what we need to do is to constantly affirm an optimistic interpretation of what we perceive. So we can perceive the police as being bullies and prejudiced against our minority group if we want to, and then you'll get the power of the state applying in a tyrannical, dark way towards you, because that's what you think will happen. But if you manage to think differently, to think something else will happen, like the police are reasonable people, their corruption goes so far, but not as far as it needs to go to reach you. If you limit their power in your mind, then it can't reach you. If you behave as though you are doing the right thing, clear of conscience, telling the truth, which is something you're not ashamed of. If you behave as though there is no need to be subject to the power of the state, then you will escape it. It takes faith. This is the operation of faith when you can do this. Those who have any power at all, especially those in high government, they become smug. They become arrogant. They experience a lack of respect for higher forces, such as God. And this is a trap that they fall into. They cannot be free. The smug cannot be free. Anyone who is arrogant cannot be free. Freedom is not an expression of arrogance. It is lighter than that. And what we have to really kind of choose is whether or not we want the protection, the umbrella protection of the state, and that gives us greater technology, greater access to trade routes, protection against perceived enemies and so on, and that sense of being parented all of our lives. If we want that, we can have that, and then we're obedient to the state. If we want freedom from that, then we need to address our own level of responsibility. We need to take more responsibility for every aspect of our lives, including, especially, how we think and what we think, giving our minds only to positive